Last week we saw some spice for Musketeers, and today we've got some new upgrades for Tachikaze, and although they might have the Ancient Dragon tag, they are surprisingly very generic. Stand up! Vanguard! Hey card fighters, welcome to another Cardfight update, and today we're gonna talk about some new reveals for the upcoming clan collection set, as we got 2 more clans revealed to us, so we got a couple of more cards to analyze, and today that means new Neo Nectar support with the upcoming Musketeer cards, and of course the new Ancient Dragons for Tachikaze. And we're gonna start off with the cards for Neo Nectar, which were revealed last week, so let's take a look at this new upgrade to the Musketeer archetype, as this will make the archetype a bit more consistent and gives it even more firepower. So first off, we've got a brand new grade 1 resource engine and a potential early game aggression tool in the likes of this grade 1 Water Lily Musketeer Roof. And Roof has the ability, although when a unit is placed on a Vanguard circle, call up to 1 plant token to the rearguard circle. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 1 or greater, call up to 2 instead of 1. This is great early game at value because you get a free plant token, which is always going to be great because Musketeers is about sacking its own rearguards to replace them with new cards from the deck. So getting a free token on the board means you can turn a token into an actual unit later down the line, which is nice. But this also has some built-in going second options, as now if you go second, you can either power up 2 columns on your very first grade 1 turn, because now you can call another grade 1 to the side, you can call a token behind your Vanguard, a token behind the other unit, and have 2 solid attacks. But if you don't want to dedicate any card from hand, you can also put those both tokens in 1 column, and now you have an 8k Vanguard swing and a 10k column to the side, so you can still pressure your opponent for solid numbers while you're in the early game. But on top of that, she also has a very nice resource skill in the likes of her second ability, which is Auto Rearguard Circle. When this unit or your other unit is placed on the rearguard circle from deck, cast retire this unit and counter charge 1. This is amazing because it's basically effectively free resources you're generating while you're popping off with your skills, as the whole deck is all around superior calling more cards to the field, and that means you're always going to activate this skill to some degree. And what I like about this particular skill is that she doesn't necessarily have to be the one that's being called to the field. So that then means that if you accidentally draw into her, she's not a dead card, as you can just place her onto the board and then superior call something else, and then you can activate her skill to refund the cost. And getting that counterblast back is very important because a lot of the skills for Musketeers cost counterblast to keep superior calling new units to the board. So this is a very nice tool to the deck, and the fact that you need to retire her doesn't really hurt you all too much because Musketeers is all about replacing its own units and to some extent superior calling even more from it, and that sometimes results in the fact that you need to superior call cards on top of your own units as you start to flood the board more and more than usual, as some of the Musketeers also create tokens while being called. Pensy Musketeer Sylvia, for example. So this is a nice card to get more value without needing to call units on top of your own units. Now if we move up to the grade 2, we see a very interesting grade 2 card in the likes of Licorice Musketeer Saul. And Saul has the ability, although when his unit is placed on the Vanguard circle or rearguard circle, if you have a Vanguard with Musketeer in its card name, cast Soulless 1 and retire a rearguard. Look the free cards from the top of your deck, choose up to 1 unit card from among them, call to the rearguard circle, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. Then, if you call a trigger unit, cast Counterblast 1 and activate all of its trigger effects. So this is basically a card that allows you to replace one of your units for a potential new Musketeer unit or whatever other units you have in your deck, as it doesn't necessarily force you to call Musketeers, which is great, as it is also a generic option as long as your Vanguard is a Musketeer. Now, incidentally, it itself is a Musketeer, so if you ride him on the Vanguard circle, you can always pop his skill. But in order to activate that skill, you need to have a unit onto the board already, so you need to have dedicated more cards on your grade 1 turn. But if you've ridden a unit that creates a token, like for example the grade 1 that we just talked about, or any of the other grade 1 Musketeer cards that do the same, you can basically sacrifice your token and then create a new unit on the board. Now the second part of this skill is actually really interesting, because now you get to the point where trigger callings might actually be the better choice, because not only make this skill always feel good, as if you accidentally see only triggers in the top 3, you don't really mind calling those triggers, because now at the very least you're gonna get their skill as well, as you get the power and the potential crit, draw or heal from it. But now you get in this situation where maybe just picking the trigger over the other actual grade 1s, grade 2s and grade 3s might be the better option, as getting the trigger effect plus the 5k body on the board might be more value than just whatever the other unit could generate by calling that to the field. So this opens a very interesting dynamic where suddenly you have more options to choose from, and now you don't immediately dismiss triggers as if you can get a trigger effect by just calling it. That's probably maybe even better than the potential of drive checking the card in the first place. But the card is going to be even better if we take a look at the Grade 3. But before we do that, there's one more thing that I want to explain for my premium players out there. Yes, this card interacts with the overtrigger, but it doesn't interact in the way that you're probably thinking of. How this card effectively works with overtrigger: if you call the overtrigger, it does activate the overtrigger's ability, but what's going to happen is that you're going to draw a card, you're going to give a unit 100 million power. The overtrigger isn't going to banish itself from the field because in the official rulings it states that in order to banish it, it needs to be in the trigger zone, but right now it's not in the trigger zone, it's on the field, so it stays on the board, but you don't get the additional effects because in the effect of the trigger itself, it literally states that in order to get the trigger effect, if it's been activated during a drive check, which this isn't. This just activates the ability of your triggers, and in that trigger ability, it has that condition. But with that said, let's move on to the Grade 3, as that allows us to see the full power of Sol, as here we have Licorice Musketeer Vera. And Vera has the ability act on Vanguard Circle once a turn, cost counter +1, and retire 2 rear guards. Choose 2 cards from your drop, put them on the bottom of your deck in any order, look at the 5 cards from the top of your deck, choose up to 2 unit cards from among them, call them to the rearguard circle, and shuffle your deck. If you call 2 with Musketeers in their card name, this unit gets drive +1 until the end of turn. So where most cards within the Musketeer archetype can just call anything, and this also applies to Vera, Vera does get more benefit from playing a full Musketeer build by getting that potential extra drive check, which is nice. But overall, this skill is basically replace 2 cards with 2 new cards on the board, which is nice because it allows you to refund your tokens into something else, or if you have a lot of on-place effects, those units can now be sacrificed to get new units that potentially have another on-place effect. But what's also great about this skill is that it allows you to send back cards from your drop into your deck. And it doesn't have any type of restrictions, so we can send back our triggers, so we potentially can hit more with Sol or drive check them more often. But we can also send back very powerful Musketeer cards that we potentially want to Superior Call later down the line again. A good example of that is the Grade 3 that's going to be reprinted in this set, as that will have a critical once it's Superior Called, and that's going to be very nice to swing with high-powered critical attacks on a consistent basis. Or we can send back the new Grade 1 for more counter charge options. But I think one of the main priorities to send back is Sol, and it all has to do with Vera's second effect, because that is continuous if your opponent's Vanguard is Grade 3 or greater, and Licorice Musketeer Sol is in your front row. All of your front row rear guards get the power from trigger effects that this unit gets. So basically, if you put the trigger power onto your Vanguard and Sol's on the board, every single trigger turns into a front trigger. So we can just play all crits, and all those crits will turn into critical front triggers. The only thing that doesn't pass on to every unit is the critical itself. But your opponent is probably going to perfect guard the Vanguard or hard guard the Vanguard in the first place, and then you can just pass on the critical to the other side, and you're going to get the full benefit from this effect, which is pretty damn awesome. And on top of that, Sol's effect becomes even better by just calling triggers, because now if you call the trigger with Sol's effect and you give the power to the Vanguard, that's not a 5k body that gets 10k power onto the board and maybe an additional effect. Now it generates 30k power while the 5k body comes into play, and the potential additional effect of a critical draw or heal, which is pretty good. And if you want, you can turn that trigger into something else by sacrificing the trigger for a new Superior Call effect for one of your other Musketeer cards. So this is a very nice engine that really capitalizes on what Musketeer is very known for, by just Superior Calling more cards to the field, benefiting from cycling through your deck, reloading the deck with more powerful targets, be it triggers or Superior Call targets, and then just gaining more value as the game progresses on and on and on and on. But of course, Neonectar isn't the only reveals that we got, as we also got some more Tachikaze cards with the new Ancient Dragon archetype, or I should say, new with quotation mark, as we already got the true Ancient Dragons, but these are the first Ancient Dragon cards within the V-Series. And we start off with a brand new grade 1 in the likes of Ancient Dragon Iguanogorg. And Iguanogorg has the effect, although if this card has an equip gauge, this cost is reduced by a countable as 1. When this unit is retired from the rearguard circle by a card's ability, cost countable as 1 and call a card to an open rearguard circle as rest. The equip gauge it has is put into the drop when retired and called. So effectively this is a skill that isn't unfamiliar to Tachikaze, especially if you're known with the Jiera of Tachikaze. It's a reoccursion effect where it allows you to save up on value as you don't have to keep dedicating cards into the board for your own sacrifice targets. What I like about this card is that it can potentially just be for free. And if you set up the correct options, being able to recurse this card over and over and over again for free can benefit you in a lot of different ways. And we have a lot of the grade 2s that on attack sacrifices its own units for specific benefits. And this can be a great target to then recall to the board. Yes, it calls an arrest, so you don't get a multi-attack option of it. But I don't think that's all too big of a problem, as this does synergize nicely with something like a Spinal Extort, as Spinal Extort can target this card as a sacrifice target, but then Spinal Extort can superior call the gauge card underneath this card to the field, but the moment this card is being retired, it still had the equip gauge. So then immediately you can superior call Iguanogorg to the field as rest, and now you have 2 cards instead of 1. Whereas you actually should have lost the Iguanogorg and you just got him for free on the board again. And you can then immediately sacrifice him again for another skill if you want to do that. Or you can keep him on the field and then potentially generate more value as the game progresses. Another very nice combo potential with this card on your very first turn, if you went second, is with Sonic Noah. As Sonic Noah is a grade 1 that on boost gives the boosted unit an equip gauge. So if this is the card that Sonic Noah is boosting, then this card will have equip gauge, and if the attack hits, the Sonic Noah abilities allows you to retire your own rearguard, and you can then retire this card to draw a card. But because you just gave the Iguanogorg the equip gauge, now you can call the Iguanogorg back to the field for free, and that means the whole Sonic Noah column attack is basically a free draw, an unhit draw for 1, for no countless, no soulblast. And I think early game value like that in a deck like Tachikaze can be very powerful, especially can keep that snowball going, as this card can keep generating value over time. Now there's one interesting thing I like about this card that maybe some people are overlooking. The ability states by a card's ability, not your card ability. So if this thing has a gauge, your opponent is going to have a hard time removing this card, because they need to waste 2 retire skills on this particular card to remove it from the field. And that means you have more sticking power to the board, which sometimes is a saving grace for Tachikaze, as it's going to need all the cards it gets to get its field presence going, or at least put up an offensive on a sizable level. This is a nice card to at least have a body on the board that then can be used for something else that has some recursion protection even against your opponent retire skills. But this card also has a secondary effect, which is marginable in some instance, which is auto rearguard circle once a turn. When your drive check reveals a trigger unit, put the top card of your deck face down as an equip gauge for this unit. Now this skill is shared among all the new cards with the Ancient Dragon name. This does synergize with its own skill, because let's say for example, you retire it mid-battle with one of your units, it loses the equip gauge but it comes back to the field. Now you attack with the Vanguard, you hit a trigger, you give it a gauge, and now it's protected during your opponent's turn. Or if you have another unit on the field that can retire your own unit, you can target it again to get it back on the field again. So there are some inherent synergies here as well, but it's a bit RNG. Now if we move up to the grade 2, we've got Ancient Dragon Dino Crowd. It has the same auto trigger effect to gain an equip gauge, but its unique effect is auto Vanguard the rearguard circle. When its unit attacks, cost Soul Blast 1 and retire a rearguard. Until the end of the battle, this unit gets power plus 10k. And power plus 5k for each of these units' equip gauges. So this is basically the main beefy attacker for the Ancient Dragon deck. Now, it's an interesting card. It has application because it's, again, a mid-battle retire option, so this can synergize with other effects. This can allow you to multi-attack with cards like Blue Sprint Dragon or Regiment Dragon and Regiodon, because you can then activate their skill, and the scene this doesn't cost a counterblast. It's more sustainable, and it does allow you to put a big number on the board if you can hit a couple triggers, or you just force more equip gauge into this particular card. So it depends on your playstyle if you like this or not. We do have other cards that are somewhat similar to this card that allows allows you to mid-battle retire something, but I think most of them cost a counterblast. This thing being a soul at least gives you the option to put the restraint on your counterblast a bit away and also utilize your soul to some extent. Now as for the final card, and probably the card where most people are the most excited about, is Ancient Dragon Spinal Dragon. This brand new grade 3 boss unit slash supporting card, as it also has the generic rearguard effect to gain an equip gauge. But the main application lies in its first effect, which is auto. When this unit attacks from the Vanguard Circle or is rode upon, cost counterblast 1 and retire 2 rearguards, get an imaginary gift Axle. If you have Axle 1, you get a power Axle, but if you get Axle 2, you draw a card. But draw a card, so that means you draw another card if you went for Axle 2. Choose a card from your hand, call to the Rearguard Circle, then choose 2 of your units and they get power plus 5k until the end of turn. So there's a lot to unpack here. So first off, this skill can activate in 2 different instances. Either when it's being ridden upon, so it's a quote-unquote break ride, or when you just attack with it. That means there are different applications and different aspects to this particular skill. Now what's actually happening here is that you use 1 counterblast and 2 of your rear guards are going to get retired to get an Axle Circle, which is probably going to be an Axle 2, which allows you to draw, and you draw another card. So you draw 2. So you refund those 2 cards or those 2 rear guards that you just sacrificed, which is great. But then on top of it, you can call a card and then you give 2 units 5k power. The awesome thing about this is that 5k power is always going to be given to actual units because it specifies units, not rearguard. So you can at the very least give 5k to your Vanguard and 5k to the newly called units if there's no other units on the board. Now if the skill activates when it's being ridden, it's going to be really awesome in the fact that you just generated 2 extra Axle Circles, that you generate one by just riding a new grade 3, but you generate also one from this skill. That in itself means you draw in a couple of cards that allows you to replenish your board with a new strategy, and then you can go ham. So it's a very nice setup play for a very strong push turn. But if you activate this during the battle phase, then this skill actually enables multi-attack. Because now you're going to call another card from your hand to the field, which then can start attacking while you're already attacking with your other units. And that extra power can then help you to overcome your defensive triggers. And this card can generate an insane amount of Axle Circles out of nowhere. Because if you ride this thing as your first grade 3, you get an Axle 2, then you attack with it, you get another Axle 2, so that's your second Axle Circle. If you ride on top of him with himself, you get a 3rd one, but you also get a 4th one because you now use the unridden effect, and the moment you attack with it, you get your 5th one. So on your second grade 3 turn, you have 5 Axle Circles to work with. That's a lot! And that's just his skill. The interesting thing about this card is that it's actually so generic that it allows you to build a deck in many different ways. You can rely on the true Ancient Dragon archetype, because you can just go with that as soon as you flood the board with Axle Circles, meaning you can call them all to the front row, and as soon as they all have the effect that if you hit a front trigger they gain a critical, that means you start to swing with like 6, 7, 8 attacks that all comes with a critical pressure. That can be devastating, as that means your opponents need to guard every single attack very early on, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. And interesting enough, within the true Ancient Dragon archetype, there is an extra extender for multi-attack options, as they have a grade 2 called Alonaros, which basically has a skill when it's placed from hand, you can counterblast 1 to check the top 3 and call another true Ancient Dragon to the field. And as soon as this particular skill of this grade 3, while you attack, Superior calls a card from hand, that will activate the Lunaros and you can call another card. And as soon as you just cleared out at least another unit from the front row and you create a new Axle Circle, you have the space for those 2 new units in the front row to then attack again without needing to call over your own units, which is great. But this card also synergizes very nicely with the multi-tech package of Gaia and Gaia himself, because you can go into Spinal Driver as your first grade 3, generate that extra Axle Circle while also putting some pressure up on your opponent if you went first, and if they go to their grade 3, you can ride Gaia on top of this, get that extra Axle Circle, so now you have 4 Axle Circles, and with Gaia's multi-tech package and its blanket power increase, you can dish out a lot of power and a lot of pain to your opponent with all the extra value that you're generating thanks to Spinal Driver and the setup this card provides. So honestly, I really like both the support for Musketeers as well as the new Ancient Dragon archetype, as they open up different lines of plays for the respective deck or just for their clan in general. As for Musketeers, they basically make the Musketeer engine really solid, and to me it feels like they are plugging the holes that the strategy had with the latest support. Now it really feels like a concrete legit strategy that can work on its own and potentially maybe even manage its way to top into the meta realm. And as for Ancient Dragons, and especially Spino Driver, it opens up so many different ways that you can upgrade the existing builds within Tachikasa. It doesn't specifically have to be the budget build, it can also work with Gaia. Maybe you can make it work with Anger Blade or any of the other old main decks. It is pretty generic, and that's what I really like about this card, as it can definitely see play even with future support, because it's such a good setup card that doesn't really rely on any type of restriction. So I like this card a lot, and I cannot wait to what we're gonna see for the other clans, as we still have a lot of reveals left, as this is just the beginning of all the reveals for Clan Selection 1 and 2. But with it said, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over patreon.com/VengaInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VengaInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!